I'm really excited for our next session from MovieLabs. In fact, here, this will be the first time they've publicly discussed some of the technical details of the MovieLabs 10-year vision for the future of media production in post and creative technologies. And this is a very fitting keynote topic and reminds me again of SMPTE's conference purpose to bring attendees updates on technology that are advancing the art and science of storytelling. And certainly, since many people's cloud strategy is, shall we say, up in the air. Thank you for laughing. I'll send you the $5 in the mail. It's really appropriate that we have folks from MovieLabs to share that vision. And to lead the discussion, we're really pleased to have Jim Helman, who is the CTO of MovieLabs, who better to talk about the technology. And as you may know, MovieLabs is a joint venture of 5 major Hollywood studios. And Jim co-founded MovieLabs, and he's been very active in many initiatives and very active in a lot of the SMPTE standards processes over the years. Prior to joining MovieLabs, Jim has held engineering leadership positions in Silicon Valley companies building 3D graphics, VR, web, multimedia products, and he's consulted extensively over the years. Jim has a PhD and a master's degree in applied physics from Stanford, so very well qualified. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jim Helman.
Thank you, Pat. All right, so first, thank you, Pat, for that introduction. Very honored to be here to present the 2030 MovieLabs vision for the next generation of production. And we look forward to working with SMPTE on some of these areas and projects. First of all, is there anyone here who doesn't know who MovieLabs is and kind of how we work and what we do? Okay, we got one. I'm glad that we're so well known. I had someone come up to me once, and there was this 1950s film post-production facility, very famous in New York, called MovieLab. And he said, wow, I thought you guys went out of business a long time ago. And I didn't know that I looked that old. But anyway, it's MovieLabs. Maybe we should change it to capital Z at the end to make sure people don't drop it. So as Pat mentioned, we're a technology JV, and we work a lot to advance the studio agenda in different organizations. So I'll skip over this. You see our 5 member studios up there. And our goal is always to, enable, better storytelling and see the wide-scale distribution of those stories. So I'm here today to talk about this white paper that we published, that we put together with our studio members. And here are some of the key contributors from the different studios, the production technology executives that contributed to the document. A lot of other people put a lot of effort into this, but there's only enough room for a few people on the slide. And I think we have at least 2 of the members out here in the slide. We have Annie Chang and Arjun Ramamurthy, who I'm sure all of you know. So the white paper, we built it kind of around 10 principles and a 10-year time horizon. The 10-year time horizon, you can argue where people are at, and certain high-end productions are maybe further along the path. But we put it 10 years because it kind of gives us enough license to say, okay, we're not going to worry too much about limitations of bandwidth and other things that may not be here today, but not so far out that we don't have some good place to ground the technology. So we can actually maybe project where a broader adoption of these technologies will be in 10 years. So why are we doing this, and why are we doing this now? So the move to the cloud, I think, has been motivated by a number of changes. Bandwidth, certainly, the wide-scale adoption of cloud processing and computing across many industries. Also, in our industry, we've seen the evolution of greater use of real-time engines in pre-visualization and things of that sort. We think all of these things kind of come together to really create a transitional point now where we have an opportunity to really shape the future of production in a way that will benefit the entire community. So we want to get to better workflows that are more flexible, that allow more rapid work and iteration. This is clearly not something that we're going to do on our own. I mean, the white paper is very much just a first step. So we need to engage with the full community if we're going to get there. And that includes studios, post-production houses, VFX houses, tool vendors, cloud platforms. So this is really kind of a call to the industry to try and move things forward. And we're working with the studio members to try to identify where are the places where we as a group can work to collaborate with software vendors, with other organizations like SMPTE and the ETC to advance some of these technologies into the industry. And so, we think that there will be a lot of publications coming out of this, whether they're best practices, specifications, APIs, et cetera. And so things like SMPTE and the TSP process could be a very good fit for some of that work. And also because all of this is really built around software, we think that open source is definitely going to have a valuable role to play in this. So here are the principles. There are 10 of them. These are in somewhat abbreviated form. I won't go through all of them. You can read them for yourself. Hopefully you already have, and you have them memorized. Oh, I see someone taking a picture, I guess. Didn't memorize them all. Pat, can we print up like a quiz to hand out at the end here? Yeah. Or, I'm sorry, actually, it should be, can you put up the Survey Monkey, please? Yeah. So the principles kind of fall into 3 categories. One of them is cloud foundations. It's kind of most fundamental here is that assets go up to the cloud and they stay in the cloud, and that applications come to the assets rather than transferring files with a spare from one facility to another facility. And so that's kind of a big paradigm shift in the way that we work. And that also has some implications for the second category, which is security and access. So if you have all of these assets in the cloud, you no longer have a facility with maybe a well-defined perimeter or even a hybrid cloud where you have a perimeter. And so we really need to rethink security and make it more asset-centric and more scalable so that you can address a wide range of productions. Because if you have a high-budget blockbuster, you may care about a wider range of assets and really, really care about them. But then if you have a cooking show or something, maybe if the fact that the souffle fell at the end of the chef's great effort, I mean, it's not, you're not going to lose a lot of revenue if that shows up on YouTube. So scalability is a key aspect of that. The third area gets into building workflows. And we think that workflows are going to be much more flexible. You'll be able to assemble them from different components using whatever the preferred set of tools and whatever is best of breed for your particular production. And also the advent of real-time engines is really enabling changes in workflow. So it's no longer just kind of a straight pipeline. Instead, you can iterate, and it's in some cases you're moving maybe a lot of editorial up into some of your pre-production work, and even for live action movies, we think that this is going to become a much more common way of working. So I think now I'll get a little bit into some details and look a little bit at building things up from some of the components. So focusing on that last item of software-defined workflows. So we think that these workflows are going to be built up of building blocks, and that this is a good way to get a lot of flexibility. Each of these tasks is going to have unique inputs and outputs and metadata, and to the extent that we can actually agree on some of these in terms of best practices for workflows, what the inputs and outputs are, how we name them, maybe even some formats around them, it'll make it much easier to have workflows that can be assembled from whatever your preferred set of building blocks are. So here's an example of how you might build up a particular workflow from some building blocks. So you have a final edit, which is creating feeds that would go into an audio mix and a color grading session, and then both of those can feed into final conform. And so in this model, assets are pulled from a common layer of metadata and asset store, and then the derivative assets and additional metadata elements such as the EDLs and CDLs are created and propagated downstream. This also gets a little bit at one of the principles around assets and non-destructive workflows. So you never want to destroy an important asset. So the extent to which you can have your workflows built around modifications to those and metadata and things that can modify them, the better you are. And also, the more you can iterate. If you have automated workflows, you can reconstruct things more easily if you actually have things that are driven by metadata. Another principle has to do with security and access. So, in this model where you have all of these different tasks being performed in the cloud, you're going to need to be propagating them to the next stage in the pipeline. And we think it's very important that the infrastructure be able to support a publishing mechanism that a user, someone who's in control of a particular stage in a workflow, has control on when things get published onto the next stage. And so, you may, when the dailies are ready for viewing, you may, propagate those out. Because one of the concerns we hear sometimes is that, well, if all of this stuff is stored in the cloud and common infrastructure, I don't have control over who gets to see it. So we think a policy and access control framework around this, along with security mechanisms that can actually enforce it, is very important. Another aspect is multi-cloud. So Principle 2 says that the applications come to the assets. So for that to happen, you're going to need to have applications, the important applications, be able to run in your preferred cloud. So we think it's very important to enable and make it easy for a tool vendor to be able to deploy their tools into multiple clouds. And also, this goal of always having the application come to the assets and the data is a little bit aspirational. So in practice, there are going to be places where you have, a post house, a VFX facility that actually they work in a different cloud. They're not going to move to your cloud. And so that's another aspect where we need to enable, the ability to have, multi-cloud applications and sharing of data and other assets. So we think that it's going to be very important to have abstraction layers that can allow these applications to easily move to whatever cloud is needed or to share data across different clouds. So that covers kind of a little bit of, I think, the three major areas, the software-defined workflows, security and access, and then the cloud foundation layers and abstractions. So that's, the MovieLabs 2030 Vision, 101 class. In the next part of the keynote here, we're going to have a discussion where Mark Turner and I, Mark worked with us very closely on developing this white paper, and we'll get into a little bit more detail in some of the aspects. Thank you.
Yeah, as Jim said, I'd now like to invite Mark Turner, who's president of Entertainment Technologists, which is a boutique consulting firm. And Mark has joined the MovieLabs team to work on this important project. So what we thought we'd do now is kind of a sort of back and forth with Mark and Jim talking a little bit in more detail about what you've just heard. And then at the end, about 10 minutes for questions. So please formulate your questions now. And there are a couple of people in the audience we might pick on, right, Andy and Arjun, to ask some further details since they've done a lot from the studio side to contribute to the project. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Mark Turner for a fireside chat.
We need a fire.
Hey, Mark. Yeah, we do. Got some matches?
All right, then, Jim. So maybe we should just, let's start with security, because you kind of touched on security at the end there. So maybe we should talk security first. And we're going to put everything in the cloud. Securing that content is kind of crucial. So maybe you should touch on where we're at with the security thoughts and where we go next.
Yeah, so we're also actually working on a companion white paper that specifically addresses security. I think, as I mentioned, it's driven a lot by this move from, kind of perimeter-based security, which is, traditional facility-based physical security, MPAA, audit guidelines. That's moved to, over to more of an IT model, a network-based, and even extended to, hybrid cloud, where some of the productions components may actually be up in the studio, but still that's sort of an extension of an on-premises system where but now you're still focused on defending the perimeter. I think here where you see a model where you're going to be having lots and lots of different people and applications coming in from all over the world to access this data. I mean, one of the great promises of this for creatives is that the work will come to you. You can work from wherever you want in the world. You don't have to, go to a place where they have a massive workstation or, a color grading suite, or you have a 3D graphics workstation. So with that model, really perimeter is no longer enough. You need to focus on assets and controlling access to those assets. And so we think it takes a new paradigm, something which is close to something which in security, people often talk about zero trust. So, okay, I really may not be trusting the infrastructure. Okay, well, a lot of cloud systems already do that to some extent by encrypting things, but they're encrypted sort of against the cloud infrastructure, not necessarily against the administrators of those systems or of those applications. And so, we think that at the high end, asset encryption has a model, kind of something maybe not too different from DRM type things where there's an authorization that involves getting access to decrypt some content. There are other techniques in zero trust that can be used that don't necessarily need encryption, and so we think from that you can put together an architecture that can allow a production to scale the level of security. How wide or narrow is the access? How strongly is the access enforced to whatever the security needs of that production are?
Right. With the idea that it's invisible to creatives.
That's the important thing.
Key point here is we don't want people hitting a security wall like they do today between them and getting their work done.
Or that we even do on Dropbox and OneDrive and Office 365.
Right. Exactly.
It needs to work very transparently.
Multi-cloud.
Yeah. So, Mark, we talked a little bit about multi-cloud. I mean, first of all, what does multi-cloud, and what does even cloud mean in this context?
Right. It's one of those things that everybody's experimenting in cloud, but we actually had to take a step back and say, okay, what do we mean by cloud? Because it's one of those misused terms. So the way we define cloud in the paper is it's internet accessible storage and compute. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's public cloud. We actually rephrased the sort of public cloud providers as hyperscale cloud providers. So those providing, large storage and massive data centers. It could be that. It could be hybrid clouds, which are, on-prem but accessible from the internet. It could be completely private. It could be a whole combination of those. And the reason why we have to address this notion of multi-cloud is, A, we want to enable competition. We don't want anybody to be feeling like they're tied into any particular cloud provider. But also, we need to start thinking about all the different players that are all moving to the cloud, that are all important in getting content made. And, we may have a studio that's got a preferred cloud, but then the post provider has got a different one. They might have 3 visual effects companies, and some of them are using on-prem, and some of them are going in a different cloud. So we may have a production that spans 5 or 6 clouds. And we need to enable workflows that support that model. So those diagrams that you were going through sort of start to explain how we can address this notion of studios owning multiple clouds, production spanning multiple clouds, distribution being in a different cloud, and yet how do you still get the benefit of cloud and all the infinite scalability and infinite storage that the promises comes with.
Yeah. And I think one of our goals here is to get the clouds out of the air and more grounded in terms of what we can do with them and really using them as tools.
We should just touch on another thing, that those diagrams we just showed about how you containerize applications. There's another extension to that, which is you really got to start breaking the cloud down into parts, right? We have a storage component in the cloud, and then there's compute, either bots or automated tasks, but on then applications that creatives are using. And you've really got to break those down into 3 different buckets because you can be handling those separately. And then there's a 4th, which we touch on in the paper, which is the user interface that a user is touching on. If you break them all into sort of different chunks, we actually need to try and design a way where you can abstract the user interface so a user can be coming in remotely using a remote desktop, accessing compute on one cloud with maybe storage on another. How do you enable that sort of flexibility in workflow, again, without a creative hitting some barrier that says, oh, I've got a login failure, or I can't access a remote workstation, or I can't access the file.
Or my tablet's not responding fast enough, or
my bandwidth isn't big enough, or whatever it might be.
So that's actually one of the areas we've identified as something that would be useful to do, is to identify some of these use cases and determine what bandwidth, what latency, what characteristics are required for some of these remote operations.
So, let's talk.
What, real-time iteration?
Let's talk about real-time.
Yeah.
Because we didn't touch on that in the.
So we touched on a little bit in the presentation, but Mark, I think you've done a lot of thinking about how what can be done to improve the current iteration situation.
Right, and it's a confluence of factors here. So let's define one of the terms that we've got in the paper is real-time engine. We went back and forth about what to call this. You would call it today a game engine. That's the sort of root of what we're talking about. But we don't want anyone to assume that they're going to be using a game engine to make a movie. The benefit that we're trying to take out of a game engine is the ability to do real-time rendering. And what happened late last year and as increasingly happening this year is we're now getting GPU cards with ray tracing in them that allows you to do photoreal ray trace graphics in real time. And we see that's going to change a whole bunch, all the way through a workflow. Right now, game engines are being used for previs, but what about all the other different places where you could use that? And we're thinking, scenarios where you've got digital objects and digital characters on set, and a cinematographer being able to look at those in real time with physical objects and physical characters next to them, with real lighting around the room. And if someone moves a light, obviously the light will change on physical objects, but it should also change on the virtual objects that you're visualizing on set as well. And for that, you need ray tracing, and you need it in real time. You can't wait for that. But we think, that sort of level of iteration will completely change what decisions are being made and actually speed up post-production, because when you can see objects and you can see how they're implemented on set and where they are in 3D space, a lot of post-production processes which are trying to figure out that stuff and figure out where lighting is and stuff, we can skip all those because you can actually know exactly where the lights are, where the camera is in reflections, where you're on set. And arguably smaller productions may actually take that real-time render and take it to market. There's been a couple of movies who actually use game engine renders to go to market. And potentially, you can see that all the way down to distribution. Again, if there's work to be done here, but if we had a packaging format that allows you to take that data about digital objects and the background plates, that expensive rendering step in post-production, maybe we can actually move all the way down to consumers and have unique media rendered for consumers.
So highly personalized content rendered at the edge.
Right, with digital objects changing or being updated as the content flows. Arjun, I'm going to call on Arjun. Fox did a bunch of work on real-time engine work on pre-production, pre-viz in green lighting. Do you want to talk a bit about it? Is your mic on? You get that front mic on? Stand up, Arjun.
Check.
There you go.
There we go.
That one.
So yeah, thanks, Mark. So one of the most important pieces for us really in kind of providing this vision is really removing any of the technological barriers that would essentially, that our creatives face. Fundamentally, we want to try and make them collaborate that much more so that they can apply all of their creative efforts towards bringing their creative vision. And a huge portion of that creative vision is really being able to iterate fast and quickly and be able to provide that kind of feedback into the actual product that they're working on. So a movie that we are actually in the post-production process currently is Call of the Wild, where we focused utilizing a real-time engine in being able to have the director, the DP, actively involved in interacting with objects, interacting with real-time animated pieces, so they could essentially set up the camera shots the way they wanted, the entire landscape. And traditionally, through the previous process, if you kind of go back a ways, it was the old storyboard model where you would essentially have storyboards where you can essentially establish camera shots as well as where the camera blocking and how the story should be paced. That then migrated to utilizing animatics and tools. And in all of those scenarios, you essentially had the DP or the director or the creative team essentially interacting with a user who would move these tools, take their notes, and then render or draw on a piece of paper. So they basically lose that iterative cycle, but then come back a day later or hours later to basically come back and see what they were asking for and then change their mind and then again redo that. Well, with real-time engines, we are basically having our creatives actively involved in the engine itself. And that was a huge success for us where we were able to have the entire movie, the entire 90 minutes. And of course, as you can imagine, it still goes through multiple iterations. It's still going through an iteration. But that's the editorial process. But at least being able to establish how the actors should move, where the camera should be, what kind of landscape shots, the actual composition and the pacing, and that was extremely helpful for us. So that was one. Another movie which we were basically just 2 weeks away from greenlighting, we actually had the director Wes Ball, in the game engine, and he would essentially be actively moving characters and actually doing the entire direction directly inside the game engine. And that's actually one of the things that we're seeing is adoption of those, but then secondly, the quality and the fidelity that we're seeing out of the game engines is also now coming to a point where you can actually show this to somebody who isn't necessarily a creative, but perhaps more a studio executive who can essentially see characters that aren't stick figures, but actually very, very realistic and almost to the final stage. So we expect that by 2030, or at least within the next 10 years, this adoption to be a lot more prevalent across all portions of the business, and hopefully also get actual final rendered frames. So,
Thanks, Arjun.
Yeah, thanks, Arjun.
Yeah.
So we want to talk a little bit about software-defined workflows.
Software-defined workflows, another phrase that we sort of coined in the paper, but it's this notion of breaking the snowflake. Everybody likes to say that every production is a snowflake, and we love that, and we want to enable that for creatives to be able to build a workflow the way they want. But it's just a real pain for everybody in the background to try and have to change and iterate in real time as the workflow is changing as they get through production. So the notion of a software-defined workflow is there is no there is commodity hardware. There is no fixed hardware that's doing any certain type of box. So you can literally build a workflow by dragging and dropping these different building blocks that we sort of talked about up there, and rearrange them. And that's actually the essence of a creative workflow, is that sometimes they want to be doing this step in front of this step, or these ones are happening simultaneously. But it's too hard to try and break down an entire movie or a TV show and standardize it. But if we can get the basic building blocks down and break those down, then you can break them down. Like, final edit is final edit. There are certain programs being used. There are certain file inputs to those. There are outputs that come out of the end. That is something in its own that we can break down. Same with dailies, same with the conform process. We can break these down into more usable modules, which is what we're doing right now. And then we can start applying some sort of standards and nomenclature and how we're going to define each one of those building blocks.
Which also makes it easier. I mean, as you have workflows change and evolve to incorporate, say, more iteration and real-time rendering,
right,
it's even more important to have workflows that you can reassemble as needed for a particular production.
Right, and there's a bunch of productions now that they have a big show will have a research phase where they're going to try and experiment with new technology, and then they'll lock it down. And they'll lock it down for 12, 18, 24 months while they're making the show. And this limits the iteration that you can do in the middle, because no one wants to mess with the workflow because the workflow is working. But if we can actually define everything in a software way, then you can rearrange your workflow as you're going along, and you can experiment. You can try beta software, and you can experiment with things which no one is able and willing to do right now.
Yeah, and maybe we can ask Annie a little bit. That I know at Universal you've done a lot of thinking around your Studio 3.0 initiative. How does this MovieLabs work?
3.0.
Oh, okay.
No, it's okay. All right. Hi, thank you. That didn't seem contrived at all, did it? Thank you for throwing that over. Hello. So what we loved about the MovieLabs paper is that it works right in conjunction with some of the initiatives that we have at Universal. So as Jim mentioned, we have something called Production 3.0. It's okay, everyone. It's like Studio 3.0, whatever you want to call it. But it's really our take on the future of filmmaking. Just since there are a lot of engineers in the room, I'll kind of talk about the versioning numbering scheme. So to us, Production 1.0 was the old days of film. Production 2.0 is where we're at now. Everything's digital, but we're still working in the old siloed film ways. So Production 3.0, what is that? If you just assume everything is digital, what do you do from a digital native standpoint for production? And all the things like how do you actually, get all your data and be able to see patterns and run analytics on that sort of stuff and everything. So our take on Production 3.0 is actually a lot of it is in the paper, but it has to do, like for us specifically at Universal, which isn't a universal only problem. It's more like a universal problem because, like, I think the studio that, well, Arjun could talk to it, but the studio I used to work for also had the same problem, which is with our production assets. Basically being able to find them and reuse them either for maybe a game or a VR experience or even for a sequel. You know, something like Fast 9 is going to want the editorial files from Fast 8, 7, and 6, right? And all those. So it's about being able to find these assets, but then the idea of this software-defined workflow, what we love about it is that our pipelines are really fragile right now. Every time we actually add in a new technology or we try to change out to a new system or something like that, it's like we have to rebuild. It's like, speaking of the snowflake workflow, it's like the idea is like every production has its own unique thing. And what we're trying to do is create basically a common framework between all of our productions that can basically talk to different systems. And like as we get new technologies like real-time engines and light fields and computational cinematography, like who knows, all that stuff, you don't want to have to rebuild the pipeline every single time. So that's a lot of it basically with this Production 3.0 effort. Another part of the Production 3.0 effort is this concept of what's principle number 9, which is the interface layer, or what we call the interchange layer. But the idea is like having a studio API, like an industry standard API that basically systems and databases and things like that could talk to, so that all the studios would have sort of the similar abstraction layer, and then that would actually be able to talk to our internal systems. And that way we can kind of exchange data freely and that sort of thing. But we do feel like if we can kind of get to that point of getting our assets in the cloud, workflows in the cloud, we can actually find our assets. And if we can relate everything together and back to the script, the concept is basically like now you can actually see, you run analytics on that sort of thing. But really all of this technology is in support of the filmmakers. And as Arjun touched upon, the idea here is not to like make technology, forefronts here. The idea is to actually make it so that the creatives don't have to worry about the technology anymore, right? We're abstracting the technology. Let them focus on the creative storytelling and not the technology that's needed to actually create the film. So, oh wow, I gotta thank you.
Thanks.
All right.
I didn't know it was gonna be inspirational.
Thanks, Eddie.
We're gonna take some questions from the audience. If you want, you're gonna have to line up for the mic, and you can ask it to us, or you can ask Annie and Arjun as well.
And be sure to identify yourself and your affiliation.
While you do that, I'm going to ask Jim one more question about where are we at in the process here? So we published the paper. That was the first step. Where are we now? Where are we going next? Maybe you should give everybody an idea of that part.
Yeah, so I think we're looking at these kind of 3 areas and trying to identify which projects and work areas need to happen soon, and which ones we actually are in a position to say collaborate with a studio and a software vendor to do a pilot, a prototype, a POC. And the studios are already doing a lot of this, so actually in some cases they can bring those elements back to us as a group, and then we would publish white papers for best practices, specifications. If there's an API involved, that's something which could go through a more detailed documentation process, perhaps in a standards group. But we think it's very important. This stuff needs to happen fast. It needs to be done kind of on an implementation basis, not at this point just getting a lot of people together in a room to talk about stuff. Because it really needs to come from the experts and the people that are doing kind of the best of breed work in each of these areas for each of these building blocks.
Right. Yeah, exactly. This is about, the world is already happening, so there's no point trying to pretend it's not. We need to absorb what's working and move forward. Okay, we'll go down the list. So as Jim said, name and company would be good before you start.
Yep, Thomas Edwards with Disney. So if you're going to have multiple vendors working together with different access on multiple clouds, is there going to have to be some overriding identity, like a Hollywood identity provider, to be able to link all of these different people in different companies with different clouds access?
That certainly is one approach, and something that could help, because you have lots of different identity management systems across productions today. People have used this email address for that one, another for a different one. The ETC recently published a white paper on consortium blockchain-based identity, which could be a system to at least have a common identifier that you could use across these different systems to at least know that these different systems are talking about the same individual, so that when you're onboarding them and offboarding them, you can do that more accurately and more rapidly. You could look at going all the way to maybe a more universal authentication system, part of a login system. That's pretty ambitious, but I think that's a discussion that we need to have with a lot of the providers of these systems to find out what is the best way to streamline this problem where you are going to have identities that are going to be working across many different applications and clouds. So it's a real problem. There's not a single simple solution to it.
But you're right, there is a need for the idea to identify a person. There's no point sharing a job with a person unless it's Mark Turner and he's an editor and he's done these ones. That's the right guy I'm trying to send it to, and not someone else completely unrelated. I would say there's a creative angle to that as well, which is it's not just good for the studio. Right now, a lot of our creatives are independent contractors. They're working on 3, 4, 5 projects at a time. They might have 10 different apps from each one of the different studios, and each one of them has got a different purpose and login, and they're going to try and remember all those different usernames and passwords. So there is a benefit to try and simplifying that world, which actually helps with security as well, because there's no point trying to have people remember 50 passwords. They will just write them down somewhere, and you just completely broke the security model if anyone was writing down their emails and passwords. Next question.
Hi, Derek Prestegard with Disney Studios. On the topic of multi-cloud, it seems to me that one of the big advantages of going into the public cloud is being able to leverage not only like elasticity, but also some of the managed services, things like RDS and Elasticache and whatnot. And I'm kind of curious if you guys have any thoughts with how that would relate to a multi-cloud strategy, because it seems like that can sometimes be a stumbling block. I'm just curious.
That's an interesting challenge, right? Because you would like to leverage the particular special capabilities and optimizations that are available, in a particular cloud. But then on the other hand, you also would like, at least we as an industry, like if the application could be, moved to the cloud where the assets are. So I mean, one approach would be at least trying to have a baseline capability for most applications, that whatever this abstraction layer and containerization can do, at least gets you up to a certain level. And then, if you want to, customize the app to use things that are capabilities that are very specific to one cloud, you can do that. And it's at the expense perhaps of some portability, and maybe it means you have to do that integration as an app provider on multiple clouds. But it's a trade-off, and I think there's no magic solution to it. Multi-cloud does not come for free.
Well, I will say one of the benefits in what Annie talked about, this notion of a common industry-wide API, is if we can get some of those basic functions up and running, we actually hope to unleash 1,000 ships of innovation around standard building blocks that we can throw out there. So we'll talk about AI and ML, right? There's a whole bunch of services that you can get from particular clouds around AI, machine learning, algorithms that speed up various different processes. We actually don't touch on a lot in the paper because we don't want to try and guess which functions are going to get done by automated programs in the future. But if we can enable a world where those functions can learn across productions, get exposed to common data, through a common API, which is secure, which understands read-only access, we can actually hopefully generate a whole wealth of new microservices that will pop up that will actually be designed around our industry and are not, generic for, IT services from other industries. But, we've got to get together and figure out what the APIs would be to enable that innovation to happen.
Yep. Right, next
Next
question.
one.
Hi, Jeff Bernstein from AMD. Two separate questions. One is this permissions thing, because if you use a cloud, you kind of yell at the top of your voice when you're trying to set permissions. Have you thought about what that user interface is and how to make that easier? Second question is, with voluminous assets, how to accelerate the transfer of said assets.
Yeah, the second one's a good one.
Well, the second one, we said the optimal thing is actually the apps come to the assets, so you're not having to move those massive assets. But
Right.
in some
If you
cases,
can
you will.
stream the user interface instead of the asset, or move the asset, then hopefully we negate some of the need to keep moving massive assets around, which is a large waste of time in a production right now. The permissions one is interesting because we have that preparing that deck that we just looked at in the cloud today, and then I had it on one cloud and I was sharing permissions and they just didn't work. Just plain don't work. So there's a lot of work to be done, even on little PowerPoint files, let alone massively complex, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of files being used on a big, movie or TV series. And each one with nuanced permissions about who can do what and who can touch it. We've actually been talking about the human factors for this stuff as well. This is not all a technology problem. There is a people problem here as well, which is, on set, are we going to need a data wrangler who is the one who's issuing permissions for assets for people all the way down to production? And production doesn't have that person right now. Should we get one of those people? How would we train them? How do we train everyone in the production to understand how to request access to an asset or provision access? And how do those assets and rights cascade down through a production from the original script that was written and who originally built it? If you've got a follow-on, we'll allow a quick follow-on.
I mean, are you thinking about like ACLs and ACEs like we have now so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel?
We haven't prescribed any of the technology. The paper is almost abstracted from technology. It talks about principles, because the next step, which we're working on now, is the how are you going to do this? And then we're going to have time for one more question, and then we're going to have to...
Well, it's more of a comment. I'm Robert Harker, and my background is computer operations. I'm also probably the oldest SMPTE student member here. And SMPTE has a new standard, 2110, that can provide the API infrastructures that you're looking for, the way to transfer content between sources and destinations. And if that becomes the backbone of the data center, rather than doing file transfers, you're actually asking for media streams, suddenly you get all this interoperability starting to work automatically. And in my opinion, that's actually where 2110 will be a lot more valuable than in the production studio. So, an interesting idea.
Jim, 2110?
So, I mean, you're seeing 2110 being used like across clouds,
Everywhere.
as opposed to just inside facilities.
so-
Yeah, I think that's right.
Traditionally, if I'm an editor and I access a file from a server, it's just a file transfer, and there's no intelligence. But if it's a real-time transfer or RTP request, I can negotiate what I want, format, content, encoders, things like that. And everything becomes a stream, and so senders and recipients all know how to talk to each other. And that solves the API problem at a very low level effectively.
Right. Yeah, at least the data, the transfer aspects of it. Yeah, interesting. Do we have time for one more question?
That allows us to have one more question.
Okay, Merrill.
Yeah, a quick comment. Merrill Weiss Group. So I heard Jim earlier talk about bringing the cloud to the ground. I always understood clouds on the ground to be fog. So SMPTE has a new activity to try and help clear up that fog. It's a group on the use of UUIDs in such a way that they're respected when applied by one application and then used with other applications, so that you don't have repeated UUIDs being applied to assets. And that group is being chaired by James Snyder of the Library of Congress, and I suggest that there may be a connection here that would be useful.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly, if you're going to be, abstracting your access to assets, you need to have a way to name and identify them. And UUIDs are certainly one mechanism, by which one asset can refer to another asset, and you can have some idea when you've gotten the right asset.
Yeah, the idea started with UUIDs, but the scope of the group is broader. So it would be, I think, a useful conversation to have.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Mike, thank you. So I think we've learned that while some people's strategies are up in the air, I think MovieLab's vision is well grounded. Let's just hope there are no thunderstorms ahead for them. And certainly there's a lot of activity, I think, as Meryl just mentioned, as we move down the road to work closely with MovieLabs and the studios as we've done in the past. And hopefully if you're interested in this topic, you get engaged in some of that work as it comes to pass. But please join me in thanking Mr. Jim Helman and Mr. Mark Turner.
Great. Thank you, Pat.
Well,